Hello, hello. Wonderful to have you here. I have an interesting story to tell you today about an event from the early suttas that seems to indicate the Buddha almost quit the Sangha at one point. It depends how you interpret a particular passage, but at least one way that this passage has been interpreted seems to show that he was on the verge of quitting the Sangha for a particular reason that we'll get to. Now, this text seems to be one of the earlier ones in the sense that there is indeed a parallel to this text in Chinese, which means that it exists in various traditions. It goes back somewhat. It's not only in one of the lineages. So it's interesting at least for that reason. Of course, one of many texts like that. And what I want to do here is to begin by reading one of the passages from this particular sutta. So the sutta says, "Now, at that time, around 500 mendicants, headed by Sariputta and Moggallana, who were the Buddha's two basically right-hand disciples, arrived at Chatuma to see the Buddha. And the visiting mendicants, while exchanging pleasantries with the resident mendicants, preparing their lodgings, and putting away their bowls and robes, made a dreadful racket. Then the Buddha said to Venerable Ananda, Ananda being his attendant, 'Ananda, who is making that dreadful racket? You'd think it was fishermen hauling in a catch.' And then the Buddha dismisses the monks. He dismissed them. He told them to leave, basically to leave from his presence, that he was not going to deal with them. Now, there are a couple of different suttas in which something very similar happens, in which the Buddha has a bunch of monks come to him. They're making too much noise, and he basically dismisses them because he doesn't like the noise that they're making. In these two suttas, there are different things that happen after that point. In the sutta that I'm going to focus on today, what happens is that once the Buddha dismisses the monks, then a number of lay people come from the town nearby and implore the Buddha to please allow the monks back. The point that they make is that many of these monks are young, are impressionable, that they need a strong teacher. They need the teacher of the Buddha's stature to keep them on the path. That if the Buddha does not come back and teach the monks, that they're in danger of basically falling off the path and living worse lives because of it. And not only that, but a deity as well, after the lay people have done then a deity comes down, a deity named the Brahma Sahampati. And Brahma Sahampati is very, very important. I'll get to that in a moment, but in any event, he comes and says the same thing. He implores the Buddha to please teach, to please allow these monks back to teach them. Further, the sutta goes on to say that Brahma Sahampati and these lay people who came from the town, it says they were able to restore the Buddha's confidence, and so he consented to allow the monks back. Now, this is a very, very interesting little passage here that these people were able to restore the Buddha's confidence. It's interesting in particular because it seems to run against a lot of the later Buddhist theorizing that has the Buddha being some kind of an omniscient being. This is not a picture we get in early Buddhism, and this particular sutta is one example of that. Because clearly an omniscient being, a literally perfect being, would not be able to be brought back to confidence by somebody else making an argument to them. In other words, that implies some at least modicum of a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding in the moment. Now, of course, there are going to be all kinds of ways that you can discuss this and reason out of it, rationalize yourself out of this, but at least if we fix ourselves on what the text actually says, it seems to reveal a Buddha who is not literally omniscient, but rather one who's able to change his mind based on arguments. I did actually an earlier video on the supposed omniscience of the Buddha. I'll leave a link to that video down below if you want to hear more. In any event, back to the point of this video, once the Buddha allows the monks back, he then asks his two main disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, about what they were intending to do when the Buddha said that he had dismissed the monks. In other words, what was their intention here? And they both have different intentions. They both had different things in mind that they were going to do. So to begin with, Sariputta says that he thought that the Buddha was going to remain passive, dwelling in blissful meditation in the present life, and so will we. In other words, what Sariputta is saying here is that he expects the Buddha basically to retire, let's say, into the wilderness, to continue the rest of his life in solitary or at least quiet meditation, in these sort of blissful meditation states, and that Sariputta and Moggallana were going to join him at that. And when Sariputta says this, the Buddha sort of chastises him and says, please don't think that way, don't say such a thing, Sariputta. Then the Buddha turns to Moggallana and asks Moggallana the same question. What was he thinking was going to happen at that point? What did he want to do? What was he intending to do? And Moggallana says this. He says, in fact, the same way Sariputta says, he says that he believed that the Buddha would remain passive, dwelling in blissful meditation in the present life. To that extent, he and Sariputta are in agreement. But Moggallana goes on to say, meanwhile, Venerable Sariputta and I will lead the Mendicant Sangha. And having said this, the Buddha approved of Moggallana's suggestion. He approved of the suggestion that he and Sariputta would lead the Mendicant Sangha, that is to say that they would take up the leading of all the monks. They would become the leaders of the monks in the place of the Buddha. Now this is a very interesting and indeed very surprising, even maybe shocking kind of development here. And it's led some important and thoughtful readers of this sutta to believe that it seems as though the Buddha was on the verge of actual retirement, of leaving the Sangha entirely. One person who said this is Bodhipaksha, who's a wonderful meditation teacher and scholar of the early material. And I'll leave a link to his blog post below in the notes where he argues this point. But just in a nutshell here, the point that he's trying to make is that we might read the first idea of the Buddha dismissing the monks in various different ways. We might read it as him just dismissing some of the monks, or the monks who were making noise, or the monks who had arrived, but not the monks that were there already. We also might understand it, and this is certainly true no matter what, as that the Buddha was dismissing the monks for a short period of time, but that he was always intending to allow them back. However, the way that Sariputta and Moggallana respond to the Buddha here seems to indicate something a bit more severe and more extreme. In other words, that they were thinking that he was not only dismissing a small portion of monks, but literally the entire Sangha, because both of them understood the Buddha to be literally intending to retire into the forest alone in meditation, perhaps forever, for the rest of his life. Because that was what Sariputta says, that they were all going to, the three of them, the Sariputta, Moggallana, and the Buddha, were going to be just sort of meditating in bliss for the foreseeable future. And similarly, that Sariputta that Moggallana believed that he and Sariputta were essentially going to take over direction of the Sangha. This implies that it's not simply a small number of monks that are being dismissed, but literally the entire Sangha was being dismissed, and that therefore they too could take over the leadership. Also, cutting against this idea that the Buddha had only intended this to be temporary is the appearance of Brahma Sahampati, this deity. Some of us will know that at the very time of the Buddha's enlightenment, there was a period of time, at least reflected in some of the early texts, where where the Buddha was on the verge of not teaching at all, where the Buddha had decided not to teach, basically, or at least was having a lot of serious doubts about teaching, that he felt that teaching would just make a lot of problems for him, that most people were not going to be open to the kind of message that the Buddha wanted to present, and so he was thinking of simply retiring into the forest alone. And it was at that point that Brahma Sahampati came down and tried to convince the Buddha to remain, or to become a teacher, I should say, and become a teacher really for the first time. And his reappearance in this sutta lends credence to the possibility that that was at least potentially going to happen again. That is to say that the Buddha was going to literally retire into the forest for good, and so he needed a divine intervention of a certain kind to convince him to remain as the teacher. Further, as I've said, the responses of Sariputta and Moggallana seem to be the responses of two people who expect their teacher to be retiring more or less for good. Now, one other interesting part of this back and forth between the Buddha and his two chief disciples is that the Buddha responds to Moggallana's statement here. I say that he was positive towards it, but what he says is this. He said, "For either I should lead the mendicant Sangha, or else Sariputta and Moggallana should." Now this here is, I think, a very surprising, interesting, and important statement of the Buddha's, because at the end of his life, the Buddha, on his deathbed, explicitly did not appoint somebody to replace him. Now, at his deathbed, indeed, the Buddha, Sariputta and Moggallana had already died. They had predeceased the Buddha. So they were not around to take over from him when he was on his deathbed. And again, on his deathbed, he did not appoint somebody to replace either him or them. So it seems as though, at least from this sutta, that from the Buddha's standpoint, the Sangha was going to either be led by him personally or by Sariputta and Moggallana, we have that here, or third, it was not going to be led by anybody in particular, but rather was going to be a kind of a quasi-democratic institution led by all the monks together, and that is where they ended up. Now, another very interesting point in this sutta is that what seems to have gotten the Buddha to this kind of breaking point here was noise. This racket that these monastics were making, where they were discussing and chattering with each other. And noise seems to have been, on a number of occasions, something that the Buddha was particularly upset over. It was sort of, if we go back to the early suttas, it was kind of like his Achilles heel, or his kryptonite, if you want to speak in those kind of superhero terms. It was something that he really didn't like, that he wanted things to remain silent. And one reason for this, of course, I'm only speculating here, but one potential reason for this is that noise is spoken of as a thorn to the first jhana. That is to say that having noise around you makes the achievement of these deep states of meditative absorption difficult or impossible. The first jhana is the first of many of these ever-deepening kinds of meditative states. And indeed, when Sariputta and Moggallana talk about what the Buddha is going to do once he leaves the Sangha, they talk about him remaining passive, dwelling in blissful meditation in the present life. And this description of remaining in blissful meditation in the present life is consistent with and seems to mirror descriptions of the Buddha's tendency to remain in jhana, or in various deeper states of absorption. That is to say, the Buddha talks about how important these kinds of states are for having a pleasant life right now, right here and right now. Now, a number of us do have problems with noise during meditation or even during our ordinary life. And in my next video, what I want to do is to discuss one possible reframing of this problem that may be helpful to us. And when that video is ready, I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. Meanwhile, if you're getting anything out of these videos of mine talking about topics in early Buddhism and related topics, please consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much to you all, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.